Hi, I'm Reverend Tom R. I am the senior pastor of Village Presbyterian Church, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this conversation, Joy Even on Your Worst Day. It is an exploration of Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. Now, Paul and I have been in conversation a long time. He's hard for me sometimes. He's arrogant, he's brash, he's dismissive of some things I think are important. Part of that's Paul, part of that's me. A lot of that is the 2,000 years that lie between us, because there's much about our world he could not possibly have imagined. He couldn't have imagined the impact of Adam Smith's capitalism, of Galileo's heliocentrism. He couldn't imagine a Jeffersonian democracy, or that you and I are having this conversation in this format. But in spite of the differences, in some important ways, Paul has become my teacher. For in this letter, he teaches that all of us are going to have good days, and all of us will have bad days. But Paul has learned it's possible to know joy even on your worst day. So together, we're going to let him teach us about that. So these few chapters of Philippians were written from jail. And what continues to draw me back to this letter to Philippians is that a writing from jail, you might expect it to have a tone of anxiety or anger or grief. But instead what we find here is a letter of joy. And what I want us to talk about is, where does that joy come from? So let's get started. In Paul's day, to write a letter, there was a tradition, a formula, if you would. You identify the writer, you identify the reader as a word of greeting, and then a word of thanksgiving. Paul follows this, but he plays with it a bit. He identifies Paul and Timothy. It's not that Timothy is writing, but even the apostle can't do Christianity alone. So he says Paul and Timothy. That would be enough. The Philippians know them. The Philippians love Paul. That's all he has to say. It's Paul. But he adds a servant of Christ. The Greek word is doulos. It can be servant or even slave, and it sounds demeaning in our ears. But for Paul, this was a lifesaver. For Paul, what he's saying is, he belongs to Christ. He lives for Christ. He serves Christ in every circumstance. And here's the point. There's no circumstance that changes that truth of who he is. And then he defines the Philippians, and he calls them saints. I don't know if you think of yourself as a saint. Most people don't. When we think of saints, we might think of the spiritually elite, those who have gotten it right, those who inspire us, Martin Luther and Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, those kind of people. Maybe you have some saints in your own life that the whole world wouldn't know, but people who have loved you into faith, people who have demonstrated for you what it is to be a disciple and follower of Jesus Christ. Those are saints in our book. But when Paul uses this term, he's not talking about our faithfulness. When Paul speaks of the saints, he's speaking of anyone whose life has been touched by grace. So that's all of us, really. It's clearly how he understands it. When he speaks of the saints in Philippi, he's not speaking of some among a larger group of Christians. No, he's speaking of the whole church. They're all touched by the grace of Jesus Christ. That's who they are. This becomes important in the whole letter. So then Paul says, I thank God every time I remember you. I love that. I don't know if you offer prayers of thanksgiving for the church very often. I have plenty of reason to do so, but it's not my practice as often as Paul suggested here. It's a good thing. He doesn't say he thanks God for everything about the church. No, I imagine the Philippians were like most churches you know, full of ordinary, broken, and beautiful people. But yet he thanks God for them, for their love for one another, for their care for him. It's a good practice to engage in prayers of thanksgiving for the people that God has put in our lives. In this prayer of thanksgiving, there are really a couple of things that he lifts up. And the first is he thanks God because they share in the gospel from the first day until now, he says. They share in the grace of Jesus Christ. They share in the gospel. He even writes this one phrase that it's hard for us to know how to translate. He says, I hold you in my heart, or it could as easily be translated, you hold me in your heart. I think the ambiguity is intentional. They hold each other in their hearts. And that's what it means to share in the gospel. To share in the gospel is not to share an idea. It's not to share a doctrine. It's to share relationship, to be bonded to one another. So when I was in college, I was a music major for a semester, but it was long enough for me to get a job in a small rural Baptist church where I got a job as their choir director. We didn't make great music, but I loved those people. But one of the things they would often talk about is how Jesus came into their heart. That's how they would say it. Jesus came into their heart. I was Presbyterian. I think I probably thought Jesus came in head first. I don't know. But either way, whether Jesus comes into our head or our heart or even our soul, I think that's too small because it ends up being just about me. I think where Jesus shows up is in our relationships. I think Jesus comes into that space between us. That's where the gospel is shared. That's where Christianity is practiced. When Paul says, I thank God for you have shared in the gospel from the first day until now, he's talking about their love for one another. Christianity is about how we are with each other. Next, Paul does something that's very Pauline. He's talking right to them, and then he looks over their shoulder toward the horizon. He does this often. He says to them, I am confident of this. The one who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Jesus Christ. In these few verses, we get an insight into how Paul understands time. He says, you share with me in the gospel from the first day, and then he speaks of the day of Jesus Christ. The first day, he probably means there the day that he proclaimed the gospel to them and they trusted it and they became this community we call the church. That was the first day. The day of Jesus Christ, that is the day of God's ultimate work of redemption. Scripture talks about it in all kinds of ways. Amos said, it's the day when justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It's the day when the lion lies down with the lamb, as Isaiah imagined it. It's the day when the poor are lifted up and the hungry are filled with good things. That's how Mary sang about it. It's the day when everything that has gone wrong is made right and God's full work of redemption is realized. That's the day of Jesus Christ, when the good work that God has begun in us is brought to completion. But what we see here is that we are living between that first day and that day of Jesus Christ. We are in these in-between days, and in the in-between days, life can be hard. In the in-between days, there's sickness. In the in-between days, relationships falter. In the in-between days, Caesar's prison can capture you. We live and we minister in these times in between. And what Paul wants us to remember is who we are, and wants us to remember that God will be faithful and God will bring that ultimate promised day. You know, there was another saint who wrote to the church from prison. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was in Germany during the reign of Hitler's Nazis, and he was captured and he was in prison because of his faith and his opposition to Hitler. He was murdered there just a few days before his camp was liberated. But while he was in prison, he wrote letters and poetry and theological treatises. He shared his faith and heart. And one of the most moving writings to me of Bonhoeffer was a poem he wrote called Who Am I? Let me read it to you. Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me I would talk to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotisms and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptibly woe-begone weakling? Or is there something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. I think Bonhoeffer knew the joy that Paul talked about. It's not a joy that denies trouble. It's not a joy that denies heartbreak, but it's a joy that rests in knowing that we belong to God and that God will be faithful. God will not keep us out of trouble, but God will bring us through. When you are in Caesar's prison, it is good to remember that you are God's child, God's servant even. You belong to God.